Weber kept the photograph in a drawer in his desk. His children found it after he died in 1987. They asked their mother what it was. She said their father had been a prisoner of war in America during the war, and that the Americans had treated him well, better than he had expected, better than he probably deserved. The photograph now sits in a small museum in Munich, dedicated to the experiences of German soldiers and prisoners during World War II. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like any other group photo from the 1940s, men standing together, smiling, enjoying a moment of peace. But it is not. It is a photograph of enemies who were allowed to be human for 2 hours on a summer afternoon in Florida. A photograph that proves even in war, even in captivity, even between nations trying to destroy each other, humanity can survive if people choose to preserve it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are sharing forgotten stories like this every single day. Real history, real people, real moments of humanity in impossible circumstances. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the UK, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. Let us know you're here. Tell us if someone in your family served during World War II. Just let us know you're part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Klaus Weber and the thousands of other POWs who experienced this strange mercy are not forgotten. These stories deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. May God protect you and your family, keep you healthy, calm your mind, and give you peaceful sleep tonight. Amen. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Klaus Weber and the thousands of other POWs who experienced this strange mercy are not forgotten. These stories deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.
The swimming trip stopped. The weather turned cooler, though cooler in Florida meant temperatures in the 70s instead of the 90s. The guards said the lakes were too cold for swimming. Weber did not think 70 degrees was too cold, but he did not argue. The trips had been a privilege, not a right, and privileges could be revoked without explanation. Instead, the camp organized other recreation activities: soccer games between barracks, chess tournaments, film screenings in the recreation hall. The films were American movies, mostly westerns and musicals, with German subtitles added by the camp administration. Weber watched a film called Stagecoach, starring John Wayne. He had never heard of John Wayne. The film was about cowboys and Indians and a stagecoach being chased across a desert. Weber thought it was ridiculous, but entertaining. The other prisoners loved it. They talked about John Wayne for weeks afterward. The rations were good throughout 1943 and into early 1944. Beef, chicken, potatoes, bread, vegetables, canned fruit, coffee, the same rations American troops received. The prisoners gained weight. Weber had weighed 140 pounds when he arrived at Camp Blanding in June 1943. By January 1944, he weighed 162 pounds. The difference was visible in his face, his arms, his posture. He was no longer the malnourished soldier who had surrendered in Tunisia. He was healthier now than he had been in 3 years. But the rations changed in May 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The war in Europe was over. 3 days later, the camp administration reduced prisoner rations. The meals became smaller. Less meat, more bread and potatoes. The camp commander, Colonel Hayes, called an assembly and explained the reason. News had reached America about German concentration camps, photographs of emaciated prisoners, mass graves, gas chambers. The American public was outraged. Congress was demanding that German POWs receive reduced rations as punishment. Hayes said he disagreed with the policy, but he had no choice. Orders from Washington were clear: reduce rations, maintain minimum Geneva Convention standards, continue work assignments. The prisoners accepted the explanation without protest. What could they say? They had not known about the concentration camps. Most of them claimed they had not known. Weber had heard rumors during his time in the Wehrmacht, stories about camps in Poland, about trainloads of people being sent east, about things happening that soldiers were not supposed to discuss. He had not believed the rumors. He had thought they were propaganda, exaggerations, stories designed to make Germany look evil. But the photographs did not lie. The piles of bodies did not lie. Weber sat in his barracks after the assembly and tried to reconcile what he had been told with what he now knew. Germany had not just lost a war. Germany had committed crimes that would stain the nation for generations, and he had been part of it. Not directly. He had been a soldier fighting in North Africa, not a guard at a camp, but he had worn the uniform. He had served the regime. He had followed orders. That made him complicit. The other prisoners did not want to talk about it. They wanted to focus on going home, on rebuilding their lives, on forgetting. Weber could not forget. The photographs stayed in his mind. The rations improved again by September 1945. The camp administration restored full meals after the initial public outrage subsided. But the atmosphere in the camp had changed. The prisoners were no longer treated with the same casual friendliness. The guards became more distant, more formal. The swimming trips never resumed. Recreation activities continued, but the tone was different. The war was over, but the reckoning had just begun. Weber remained at Camp Blanding until March 1946. The repatriation process was slow. Thousands of German prisoners were scattered across camps in America, and shipping them back to Europe required coordination with British and French authorities, who were also dealing with millions of displaced persons. Weber's turn came on March 12, 1946. He and 300 other prisoners were loaded onto buses and driven to Jacksonville, where they boarded a Liberty ship bound for France. The voyage took 14 days. Weber spent most of the time on deck, staring at the ocean, thinking about the past 3 years. He had left Germany in 1942 as a soldier. He was returning in 1946 as a prisoner, with memories of picking oranges and swimming in a Florida lake while American guards ate sandwiches and told stories about Pennsylvania. The ship docked in Cherbourg on March 26th. French authorities processed the prisoners through a collection center, then loaded them onto trains heading east toward Germany. Weber reached Munich on April 3rd. The city was destroyed. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. The streets were filled with displaced persons, refugees, former soldiers trying to find their families. Weber found his mother living in a basement apartment in what remained of their old neighborhood. His father had been killed in an air raid in 1944. His younger brother had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1945. His mother had survived by working in a factory making uniforms until the factory was bombed. She was 52 years old and looked 70. Weber stayed with her in that basement apartment and tried to find work. There was no work. The economy was destroyed. The currency was worthless. People traded cigarettes and canned food instead of money. Weber used the skills he had learned in Florida. He found odd jobs in construction, repairing buildings, clearing rubble. The pay was minimal, but it was enough to buy food on the black market. He worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, rebuilding a city that would take decades to fully restore. He never talked about Florida. When people asked where he had been during the war, he said North Africa and left it at that. But he thought about Florida often. He thought about Lake Geneva,
about swimming in warm water while American guards watched from the shore. He thought about Corporal Matthews eating an orange and grinning. He thought about the absurdity of enemies playing in water together during a war that had killed 60 million people. And he realized something. The Americans had not been trying to humiliate him by letting him swim. They had been trying to remind him that he was still human, that war did not erase humanity, that even in captivity, even as an enemy, he deserved to be treated with basic dignity. That was the lesson carried forward. Not that America was perfect, not that the war was justified, but that humanity could survive even in the worst circumstances if people chose to preserve it. Weber lived in Munich for the rest of his life. He married in 1949, had 3 children, worked as a construction foreman, and eventually opened his own small contracting business. He never returned to America. He never tried to contact any of the guards who had supervised him at Camp Blanding. But he kept one item from his time as a prisoner, a faded photograph taken at Lake Geneva on that June afternoon in 1943. The photograph showed 12 German prisoners standing on a sandy shore, wet, smiling, looking like men on vacation rather than enemies in captivity.
Weber floated on his back and stared at the sky. The Florida sky was different than the North African sky. Clearer, bluer, no dust. Weber heard splashing nearby. One of the guards, Matthews, had waded into the water up to his knees. He was laughing at something another guard had said. Then Matthews dove forward and started swimming. He swam past Weber, heading toward the center of the lake. Another guard, a sergeant whose name Weber did not know, also entered the water. Within 5 minutes, 3 American guards were swimming alongside 12 German prisoners. They were not swimming together exactly, but they were sharing the same water, the same space, the same moment of recreation during a war that had already killed millions and would kill millions more before it ended. Weber climbed out of the water after 30 minutes. He sat on the sandy shore and watched the scene. This was not supposed to happen. Wars were not supposed to include moments where enemies played in water together. But here it was, real, undeniable. At 4:15, Matthews called the prisoners out of the water. Time to return to camp. The prisoners dressed, climbed back into the truck, rode back to Camp Blanding in silence. Weber could not speak. He had nothing to say that would make sense of what had just happened. That night, back in the barracks, Weber wrote a letter to his mother in Munich. The letters were censored, so he could not write about military matters or camp locations or anything that might be useful to Germany. He could only write about general conditions and his health. He wrote that he was safe, that the Americans were treating him well, that he had gone swimming that afternoon. He knew his mother would not believe that last part. He barely believed it himself, but it had happened. The swimming trips continued throughout that summer. Once or twice a month, depending on work schedules and guard availability, prisoners who had completed their weekly quotas could volunteer for supervised recreation at Lake Geneva or other nearby lakes. The trips always followed the same pattern: 12 prisoners, 3 guards, 2 hours, returned by evening. The guards always brought their rifles, but they rarely needed them. No prisoner ever attempted to escape during these trips. Where would they go? They were in the middle of Florida, hundreds of miles from any neutral territory, wearing uniforms marked with PW. Escape was theoretically possible, but practically impossible, and most prisoners did not want to escape. The conditions at Camp Blanding were better than the conditions they had experienced in the Wehrmacht during the final months of the North African campaign. Better food, better shelter, no combat, no officers screaming orders, no constant threat of death. Some prisoners called it a golden cage, comfortable but still confinement. Weber called it something else. He called it a chance to survive. The alternative was returning to Germany, which by mid-1943 was being bombed daily by Allied aircraft. The alternative was being sent to the Eastern Front, which was consuming entire German armies in battles that made North Africa look like a training exercise. The alternative was death. So Weber picked oranges, attended the swimming trips when he could, played chess in the barracks, and waited for the war to end. The work in the citrus groves continued through June and July. Weber became efficient at picking. By his third week, he could fill his 30 boxes by 3 in the afternoon. That gave him 2 hours of rest before the truck returned to camp. He spent that time sitting under the oak tree, eating oranges, watching the American guards. The guards changed periodically. Some were friendly, some were indifferent, none were cruel. Weber noticed that many guards were older men, too old for combat duty, or younger men who had been classified as unfit for overseas deployment due to injuries or medical conditions. These men had drawn garrison duty, supervising prisoners in Florida instead of fighting in Europe or the Pacific. Some of them seemed embarrassed by this assignment. They wanted to be in combat, proving themselves, earning the respect of men who were actually fighting. But Weber thought they had drawn the better assignment. They were alive. They would go home when the war ended. That mattered more than medals or glory. In August, the work shifted. The citrus harvest was ending. Patterson, the foreman, told the prisoners they would be reassigned to other labor projects. Some would go to logging camps in northern Florida. Others would work construction on military facilities. Weber's group was sent to a Minute Maid processing plant being built near Winter Haven. The plant would produce frozen concentrated orange juice, a new technology the military wanted for supplying troops overseas. The prisoners worked construction, pouring concrete, laying bricks, installing plumbing. The hours were the same, 8 to 5, but the work was harder than picking oranges. Weber had no construction experience. He learned as he went. The American civilian contractors supervising the project were patient. They demonstrated each task, corrected mistakes without anger, and paid the prisoners the same 80 cents per day in camp script. By September, Weber had saved $60 in script. He spent it at the camp canteen on cigarettes, candy bars, and writing paper. The canteen also sold Coca-Cola, which Weber tried once and decided tasted like medicine. The other prisoners disagreed. They loved Coca-Cola. They bought it by the case and drank it while playing cards in the barracks. Weber preferred water. The news from Europe filtered into the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts. The guards allowed prisoners to access in the recreation hall. By September 1943, Italy had surrendered. Mussolini had been overthrown, and the new Italian government had switched sides. German forces in Italy were now fighting alone against Allied and British troops pushing north from Sicily. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was advancing after the disaster at Kursk. Germany was losing, not quickly, but inevitably. Weber understood this before most of the other prisoners. He had studied the maps, calculated the distances, counted the divisions. Germany could not win a war on 3 fronts against enemies with superior numbers and superior industrial capacity. The only question was how long the war would continue and how many more men would die before Germany accepted defeat. Weber hoped the end would come before he was repatriated. Being a prisoner in Florida was preferable to being a soldier in Berlin when the Red Army arrived.
At 2:47 in the afternoon on June 18, 1943, Oberreiter Klaus Weber stood in the back of an American Army truck watching palm trees pass through the canvas opening, trying to understand what was happening. 24 years old, captured 3 weeks earlier in Tunisia, sent across the Atlantic on a Liberty ship, expecting a prison camp that looked like the ones he had heard about in propaganda films. Dark cells, interrogations, starvation rations. Instead, the truck was heading west from Camp Blanding towards something the American guards called Lake Geneva, and Weber had no idea what that meant. The guard sitting across from him, a corporal named Matthews, was eating an orange and grinning. Matthews had told Weber and the other 11 Germans in the truck that they were going swimming.
Weber thought he had misunderstood the English. Swimming in the middle of a war? In the middle of captivity? The mathematics made no sense. Weber had surrendered to British forces on May 12 near Tunis. His unit, the 21st Panzer Division, had been surrounded for 3 days, with no food, no ammunition, and no hope of relief. When the British tanks rolled through their position, Weber and 140 other men walked out with their hands raised. The British had been correct. They fed the prisoners, gave them water, processed them through a collection point where thousands of German and Italian soldiers sat in wire enclosures waiting for transport. Weber spent 9 days at that collection point before being loaded onto a ship bound for America. The voyage took 17 days. The Liberty ship carried 800 German prisoners in the cargo holds. The conditions were not brutal, but they were not comfortable. Too many men in too little space, seasickness, heat, the smell of unwashed bodies, the constant fear that a U-boat might torpedo the ship without knowing Germans were aboard. When the ship docked at Norfolk, Virginia on June 9th, Weber had lost 14 pounds. American military police marched the prisoners onto trains. Weber's group traveled south through Virginia, through the Carolinas, into Georgia, finally into Florida. The landscape changed. Pine forest gave way to swamps, then to flatlands covered in sand and scrub palmetto. The heat intensified. By the time they reached Camp Blanding on June 11th, Weber understood he was somewhere tropical, somewhere nothing like Germany, somewhere he would probably remain for the duration of the war. Camp Blanding sat on 170,000 acres of land northeast of Starkey, Florida. The base had been built in 1939 as a training facility for American infantry divisions. By 1943, it also housed German prisoners of war. Weber and his group were processed through the POW compound on the western edge of the base. They were photographed, fingerprinted, issued clean uniforms, American field jackets dyed with large POW markings on the back, canvas shoes, 2 blankets, a mess kit. They were assigned to barracks, wooden structures with screened windows and tin roofs, 20 men per barracks. Each man received a cot, a footlocker, and a small shelf. Weber had expected concrete cells and guard towers with searchlights. Instead, he found something that looked like a summer camp. The barracks were clean. The latrines had running water. The mess hall served hot food 3 times a day. On his first night at Camp Blanding, Weber ate beef stew, white bread, canned peaches, and real coffee. More food than he had seen in the last 6 months of fighting in North Africa. He sat at a long table with other prisoners and tried to understand what kind of prison gave its inmates beef stew and coffee. A sergeant named Hoffman, another prisoner who had been at Blanding for 2 months, explained the situation. America had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. The convention required that prisoners of war receive the same quality of food, housing, and medical care as the capture nation's own troops. America was following the rules. The prisoners would work, but they would be paid 80 cents per day in camp script that could be spent at the canteen. They would work 8-hour days with rest periods. They would receive adequate food and clothing. They would not be beaten or tortured or executed. Hoffman said all of this in a matter-of-fact tone while eating his beef stew, and Weber realized the sergeant was telling the truth. This was not propaganda. This was policy. The work began on June 14th. Weber and 50 other prisoners were trucked to citrus groves 20 miles west of the camp. The groves stretched for miles, endless rows of orange trees heavy with fruit. The foreman, an American civilian named Patterson, explained the job through an interpreter. Each prisoner would be assigned 30 boxes to fill. Each box held up to 100 pounds of oranges. Pick the fruit carefully. Do not bruise it. Stack the full boxes at the end of each row.
Work hours were 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, with a 1-hour break for lunch. Once a prisoner filled his 30 boxes, he was done for the day. If he finished early, he could rest in the shade. Patterson made it clear that working fast benefited the prisoners, not just the growers. Weber started picking at 8:25 that first morning. The work was simple but physically demanding. Reach up, grab an orange, twist and pull. Place it gently in the canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. When the bag was full, empty it into a wooden box. Repeat. The Florida sun was brutal. By 9 o'clock, Weber's shirt was soaked with sweat. By 10 o'clock, his shoulders ached from reaching overhead. By 11 o'clock, he understood why Patterson said speed mattered. The faster he worked, the sooner he could stop. Weber filled his first box by 9:30, his second box by 10:45. He was getting faster as he learned the rhythm. Pick, twist, pull, place. Do not think about it. Just move. By noon, he had filled 9 boxes. The lunch break came at 12 o'clock. The prisoners sat in the shade of a large oak tree near the packing shed. The guards distributed sandwiches, bread with cheese, and some kind of meat Weber could not identify. They also distributed oranges, as many oranges as the prisoners wanted to eat. Weber ate 2 sandwiches and 3 oranges. He drank water from a canteen the guards refilled from a pump near the shed. Then he sat with his back against the oak tree and watched the American guards sitting nearby, eating the same sandwiches and oranges. One of the guards, a private named Kowalski, offered Weber a cigarette, American tobacco, Lucky Strike. Weber accepted. They smoked in silence for a few minutes, before Kowalski asked in broken German where Weber was from. Munich, Weber said. Kowalski said his grandparents had come from Bavaria before the First War. Small talk between enemies during a lunch break in a Florida orange grove. Weber resumed picking at 1 o'clock. He filled his remaining 21 boxes by 4:20 in the afternoon. He stacked the last box at the end of his row and walked to the packing shed to report completion. Patterson checked the boxes, counted them, and marked Weber's name on a clipboard. Weber was done, 40 minutes early. He sat under the oak tree with 7 other prisoners who had also finished, and waited for the truck to take them back to camp. That night in the barracks, Hoffman told Weber that the weekend would be different. Saturday and Sunday were rest days, no work. The prisoners could sleep, play cards, attend religious services if they wanted, or participate in recreation activities the camp organized. Weber asked what kind of recreation. Hoffman grinned. Sometimes they let us swim. Weber thought he had misunderstood the English. Swimming in the middle of a war? In the middle of captivity? The mathematics made no sense. On Saturday, June 19th, at 2:30 in the afternoon, a sergeant named Daniels walked through the POW compound, announcing that 12 prisoners could volunteer for a swimming trip to Lake Geneva. Supervised activity, 2-hour duration, return by 5 o'clock. Weber volunteered. He hadn't been swimming since he was a teenager in Bavaria. The idea of swimming in an American lake while being a prisoner of war seemed absurd. But Hoffman had said it was real, and Weber wanted to see if that was true. That was how Weber ended up in the back of the truck at 2:47 in the afternoon, watching palm trees pass through the canvas opening, while Corporal Matthews ate an orange and told him they were going swimming. The truck drove for 20 minutes before stopping at the edge of Lake Geneva. The lake was maybe 300 yards across, clear water, sandy bottom visible near the shore, pine trees surrounding it on 3 sides. The 2 guards led the prisoners down to the water. The prisoners were still wearing their POW-marked uniforms. Matthews said they could swim in their clothes or swim in their underwear, whatever they preferred. Most of the prisoners stripped down to their underwear. Weber kept his pants on but removed his shirt. The water was warm. Weber waded in up to his waist, then dove forward and swam. He hadn't realized how much he missed this. The feeling of water,
the weightlessness, the silence.